The Divided Self, Part 1, Whispers of Existence. Chapter 1, Shadows in the Mirror. Michael Rowe leaned against the cold glass of the subway window, his reflection fractured by streaks of dirt and grime. The city blurred past, its lights smearing into neon echoes of a restless world. He closed his eyes, hoping to escape the unease tightening his chest, but the whispers returned. Fragments of conversations he hadn't heard, accusations he hadn't faced, voices that didn't belong to him but still felt insidiously familiar. "That's him," a voice murmured, just loud enough to slice through the rumble of the train. Michael's eyes snapped open, locking with a stranger's in the dim reflection. A man in a rumpled suit stood at the far end of the car, staring as if Michael were a ghost. His lips moved again, but the words were lost in the clamor. The train screeched to a stop. Without thinking, Michael pushed through the doors and onto the platform. He didn't wait to see if the stranger followed. The cold air bit his face as he emerged into the streets, bustling with life but devoid of comfort. He turned down an alley, hoping to lose himself in the maze of buildings. Somewhere behind him, a hurried set of footsteps echoed his own. His phone buzzed, pulling him back. The news alert on the cracked screen read, "Local journalist wanted in connection to murder." Below the headline was a blurry image of a man entering a building. The man was him, or someone who looked just like him. His stomach churned as the details of the report scrolled by. The timestamp placed him at the scene of a brutal slaying just 2 nights ago, the same night he'd been meeting a source on a different story. He had an alibi, didn't he? Michael sat in his apartment, a modest box perched above a convenience store, its cluttered interior a reflection of his spiraling thoughts. Notes and photos covered the walls, a patchwork of unanswered questions and half-formed theories. His fingers twitched over an unopened bottle of whiskey, but he shoved it aside. The weight of addiction sat heavy on his shoulders, but tonight, paranoia outweighed the craving. On the desk, his laptop glowed with the grainy footage from the news. The timestamp placed him at the scene of the murder, a brutal slaying in a nearby city. He scrubbed through the footage frame by frame, the man's stride, posture, even the slight tilt of his head uncannily. Familiar. But Michael hadn't been there. He'd been miles away, chasing a lead on corruption in local government. Hadn't he? A knock at the door made him jump. His heartbeat thundered as he approached cautiously. Peering through the peephole, he saw nothing but shadows. Another knock, sharper this time. He opened the door a crack, finding a folded piece of paper on the floor. "Stop digging." Michael stepped back, scanning the empty hallway before shutting the door. The note trembled in his hand. He slumped into his chair, staring at the wall of notes. A pattern lurked just out of reach, a truth cloaked in static and noise. He needed answers. The diner was nearly empty, its flickering neon sign casting an eerie glow on the cracked vinyl booths. Michael nursed a coffee, his fingers drumming against the mug. The woman behind the counter eyed him warily, her glances darting to the TV in the corner. His face lingered there briefly before switching to the weather. The man slid into the booth across from him. Michael recognized him instantly. The stranger from the subway. Up close, the man's features were eerily familiar, a disjointed echo of his own. His sharp cheekbones, the lines around his mouth, the resemblance was uncanny. "Michael Rowe?" the man asked, his voice low and urgent. Michael tensed. "Who's asking?" The man leaned closer, his expression unreadable. "You don't know who you are, do you?" The question struck like a physical blow. Before Michael could respond, the man rose abruptly, leaving a photograph on the table. It was a faded image of a woman with soft eyes and a cryptic smile. Scrawled on the back were 2 letters. ER. "Wait," Michael called out, but the man had already slipped out the door. Michael rushed after him, scanning the streets, but the stranger had disappeared into the city's restless tide. The photograph felt heavy in his hands, a weight tethering him to a mystery he couldn't ignore. Back in his apartment, Michael pinned the photograph to the wall beside the other fragments of his life. His gaze lingered on it, the woman's face both alien and familiar. Somewhere in her smile lay a thread to his identity, a connection to the accusations and threats now circling him. The night deepened, but Michael didn't sleep. His fingers danced across the keyboard, scouring online archives for any mention of the initials ER. Hours passed in a haze of dead ends and tangential connections until he stumbled upon it. An old obituary for Elizabeth Rowe, a brilliant geneticist whose groundbreaking work had been mired in controversy. The obituary mentioned 2 sons. Michael's breath caught. The name felt too close, too personal. His fingers hovered over the keys before typing again. Project Nemesis. The search returned nothing. At least, nothing accessible from a public connection. But the seed was planted, the edges of a labyrinthine conspiracy beginning to take shape in his mind. The next morning, Michael walked through the city with a renewed sense of urgency. He returned to the diner, hoping to find the man again. But the booth was empty. Frustrated, he turned to other avenues, tracking down addresses and contacts linked to Elizabeth Rowe's name. Every step felt like peeling back a layer of his own skin, raw and uncertain. The few who would speak to him only deepened his confusion, their half-whispered warnings steering him further into paranoia. At a library's public terminal, Michael finally found a sliver of hope, a faint trace of a defunct research facility tied to Elizabeth Rowe's name. The location was miles away, nestled in an industrial zone long abandoned. He copied the address, his pulse quickening as the pieces began to coalesce. As the first light of dawn crept into his apartment, Michael stared at the wall, the photograph of Elizabeth Rowe, now the centerpiece of his chaotic collage. The question swirled, louder now, insistent and unrelenting. Who was Elizabeth Rowe? Who was he? And why was someone willing to kill to keep him from finding out?